Welcome, everybody. We are so glad to have you with us. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture and founder of the Parent Education Series. The Parent Venture is a nonprofit organization that brings you this program today, the Parent Education Series. We are so proud to have with us today Lori Sackler and the M Word, the Money Talk for the Next Generation. This is actually a talk that we've been wanting to do for years, and I really was searching for the right person. When I found Lori recommended in a wonderful book called This Is Not the Life I Ordered, I knew that she was the person to talk to. And in fact, she literally wrote the book, The M Word, the Money Talk Every Family Needs to Have About Wealth and Their Financial Future. We could not be more thrilled again to have Lori with us today. And I'll be telling you a little bit more about her in just a minute. We would not be here today without our generous sponsors, Carlmont PTSA, the Sequoia Healthcare District, Peninsula Healthcare District, Sequoia Union High School District, San Mateo High School District, and this organization, the Parent Venture. Again, special thanks to today's presenter, Lori Sackler, financial advisor and author of The M Word. Most of you by now are familiar with Zoom's format, but we wanted to let you know that today is a webinar. That means that Lori, our presenter, will be offering content for about 45 minutes, and then we really want to hear from you, the audience. This is a webinar, so that means there's two ways for you to interact with us. In the chat, my co-founder, Bev Hartman, will be putting resource links. Please look for that. You can talk to us and to one another in the chat button. But also, we would like you to put your questions in the Q&A. So comments and resources in the chat, questions in the Q&A. I'm sure you will have lots of questions today for this very important topic. The M Word, the money talk for the next generation. Again, we will have, this event is being recorded and will be available soon on our video library. We thank the Boys and Girls Club of the Peninsula for producing our videography. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about today's featured presenter. Lori Sackler is a financial advisor, family wealth director, and founder and leader of the Sackler Group at Morgan Stanley. A thought leader in the industry, Lori has authored several books and publications around what she calls the M Word, the money talk. These publications focus on topics such as family talks about money, financial literacy, and guiding families through life transitions. Pardon me. Lori earned her BA from the University of Michigan, and she holds an MS in marketing and finance and a master's degree in music from the University of Texas. Forbes has repeatedly named Lori one of the top women wealth advisors in the US and one of the best in state wealth advisors in the US. Outside the office, Lori proudly acts as a mentor to the next generation of women in financial services, and she is involved in civic activities, sitting on several boards in New Jersey and New York City. In her free time, Lori also enjoys yoga, music, travel, and is an avid reader. We are so grateful to her for generously joining us today. Please join me in a really warm virtual welcome for Lori Sackler. Take it away, Lori.
I can hear all that applause too. It's great. Thank you. So what a kind introduction. I want to tell you that, you and I have been talking back and forth for some time about my speaking. So I'm really grateful that you reached out to me through the book. This Is Not the Life That I Ordered. And I'm so appreciative that you and Bev Hartman created this wonderful organization. It's quite inspiring. So I was thrilled to be a part of the project, and I feel very privileged to be here today to speak to you on this topic. Last time I spoke on this topic of helping to educate the next generation about money and having money talks was in 2014 when I spoke in New York City at the McGraw-Hill building for the nonprofit education, the educational nonprofit WISE, which is really devoted to helping teachers of middle school and high school students promote financial literacy in their schools. And so we would all probably agree that two main influencers of children are their teachers and their families, and of course, social media and their peers, et cetera. But what I have found that families, teachers and parents are very eager to help promote and advance financial education and communication with the next generation. So it's really, it's great to be a part of this conversation today with parents like you. I would ask, I obviously can't see a show of hands or your response, but I would ask you to think, have you had a difficult time having money talks with your family and children? And even though I can't get a response, the fact that I'm told that we have several hundred people on this webinar, I imagine there are a number of you who do have a difficult time and are interested in figuring it out. And of course, I welcome you being here. And I want to remind you that it is tough. It's tough to talk about money, particularly with family members and the younger generation, where you're really trying to also educate them at the same time. So what I hope to accomplish today is the following. I hope to help you understand why it's so important and why it's so difficult to have these conversations. Secondly, I want to help you identify and overcome the obstacles that are interfering with you having the conversation. And then I want to provide you with a framework, what I call my 5-step process for having productive conversations with your family members. And I would add in a way that will keep not only your family relationships intact, but your money as well. So I would imagine that sounds like I'm going to conclude that I think that that sounds like a good set of it's a good outline of things to accomplish. So let me just, moving right along, I thought it'd be helpful to start with the agenda and give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about over the next 30 to 40 minutes. So I'm going to help you understand the different generations. I'm sure you've thought about this, you've probably experienced it, but we're going to put it in a summary format so you can really take a look, and we're going to talk about the different characteristics and how that plays into the difficulty in having successful money conversations. I'm going to share with you some of the observations that the Sackler Group has made as a result of working across generations like we do. We're going to talk about the topics that require money talks with the next generation. I'm going to introduce that 5-step plan to you. And at the same time, we'll talk about why it's so difficult, why it's so important, and we're going to get into some of the obstacles. And then I'm going to provide you with a couple of examples of middle and high school kids from different backgrounds, socioeconomic, with different goals, aspirations, and so you can get a sense of some real life examples. And then we're going to open up to a Q&A. Okay. Now here's what I call the generational cycle. If you look at all these bands, you're going to see the different generations. If we go from 1901 to 1924, that's what we call the unraveling period. We have the GI generation, those who served in World War II, experienced the Great Depression, a tough time. And what we find interesting about that generation, that's my father's generation, is they were very civic minded. They came back from the war and they really wanted to make a difference in their communities. And it's very much like the Gen Ys or the millennials. The next generation, the crisis generation, they lived through the bust, the crash, the depression also. They lived through multiple crises, and they're a very adaptive generation, much like the Gen Z. So we see these generational cycles repeat themselves. Then we go into the baby boomer generation. I'm a proud member of the baby boomer generation, and I have 2 wonderful millennial kids. But this was a generation that started off very idealistic, became extremely materialistic, really focused on career. We'll talk a little bit about them. Then we move into what we call an awakening generation. Was this generation from 1965 to 1981. We call those the Gen X's. That was a period in time when the women were moving in large numbers into the workforce. So as a result, this generation is often referred to as the latchkey generation. Not a big population segment of the overall population, but a meaningful one. And then 1981 to 1984, these are the millennial, the Gen Yers, very much like the GI generation, lived through multiple crises. We'll talk to you about what they've experienced, and then followed by the Gen Z from 1995 to 2010, really have dealt with a number of crises and are very, very adapted. And I would tell you that these dates vary. There's not a hard line. So oftentimes you'll see Gen Zs starting from 2000 to 2015, but it's good to see that they tend to repeat themselves, and there's definitely relationships between all those generations. So the youngest generation, this Gen Z population, The youngest ones in that generation are anywhere from 7 to 12, and the older members of that generation are 22 to 27. So this may be the generation that many of you are interested in learning more about. Let's talk about the boomers for a moment. As I mentioned, very idealist, turned very career-oriented. They are 21.4% of the population. As of September. Just 10 years ago, they were 24% of the population. So, you know, my generation's moving out and the next generations are moving in. And of course, we'll talk about those future generations. But look at the formative events which shaped them. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, Woodstock, and assassinations of three major political figures in the nation, JFK, Martin Luther King, and RFK. The communication for them was really more comfortable with face-to-face and telephone. But, you know, like many of us boomers, we become more facile with texting and, of course, do a lot with the email. But what I find fascinating about this generation, because I work with a lot of them, is, you know, they do like the FaceTime, but they're also very loyal, right? They tend to stay in companies for 20, 30 years. When we look at what's going on with the millennials at Gen Z, they're going to have at least 6 careers, not to mention the number of jobs they'll have. So they were fairly loyal, and that actually plays with their idea of working with institutions as well. So we move right along. We get to the generation, the millennials. So they're, as we know, they're very civic-minded. Born between 1981 and 2000, 21.97% of the population. They are the largest segment of the population now. They're largest members of the workforce. So they are entering their higher peak in earning years. And so you're going to see, you know, we're going to see a lot more of their influence over time. But in 2016, they surpassed the boomers. And what are some of the formative events that they've dealt with? Well, 9/11 was a big one. I remember my son calling me up when he was a senior in high school and I was at work when 9/11 occurred and he wanted to make sure I was okay. It was a really traumatic experience for this generation. Of course, they also experienced the Oklahoma City bombing, Columbine, the first really big school shooting. As we know, this becomes almost a daily event. They were very much involved with texting, email, social media. We talk about how they text versus talk, right? And their work ethic is pretty interesting. They believe in their relationships at work. They want to create relationships. They have a cause. And this is another fascinating piece about them. They'll want to get a job. You know, they're eager to work, but they want more of a blended and balanced life than the boomers wanted. So they'll often talk about what their hours want. They want in terms of hours. They want flexibility. It's definitely a different generation. For those of us who work with them in the workforce, we've had to adapt, okay, because they're such a major force. Let's talk a little bit more about their characteristics. They're very economically optimistic right now. This was not the case 10 years ago when we were going through the Great Recession. They have faced more challenging economic times. They saw their parents suffer through the Great Recession. It was difficult, but it was also shaped them in ways that are different from the boomers. They're very detached from institutions, which can be a problem for the boomers as they want to introduce their kids to the people that they work with, and they believe in institutions. My son went to Robin Hood to start with. That was his institution. I had to finally convince him he might need a little advice. They're politically independent and socially liberal. This is the most highly educated segment of the population. And so oftentimes with education becomes an open-mindedness. We refer to them as digital natives. They focus on themselves. We also refer to them as the me generation. We gave them a lot of 5 stars growing up. So they really have a sense of self. But they're also more confrontational. They're willing to speak their mind while they're also idealistic and civic-minded. I think this is a great generation, and I think we may be blessed and see how they take on more responsibility over time. Let's talk a little bit about the Generation Z. This was a generation that experienced the Great Recession also. They were younger. They experienced 9/11. What was a Columbine single event is now a norm for this generation. It's a really difficult thing to be in school, and I'm sure as parents, you worry about this. with all the school shootings take place. This was another event that shaped them, the Supreme Court ruling gay marriage. That is a reflection of how open they are. They do not see race, gender, like previous generations have. We call them the supreme digital natives. And they're very parallel with the silent generation in the sense they do have a sense of civic duty, which I think is wonderful. We refer to them as millennials on steroids, very politically progressive. Diversity is their norm. What I find fascinating is this is a core characteristic, a core value of this group. They grew up in very diverse households, both gender and composition. They've gone to schools with diversity. Unlike me and many of my boomers, we did not have that exposure to diversity as kids. So they really are accepting of diversity, and that I think will shape the political norm over time. They're pragmatic and financially minded. This, in fact, was shaped by the Great Recession and seeing their parents suffer through it. They really want financial security, and both the millennials and Gen Zs are very interested in looking long-term to their financial planning. There are kids that come into my office and say, I want to start planning for retirement. So it's a very fascinating aspect of that generation, but they relate to institutions in an analytical and pragmatic way. So you gotta show their worth. You gotta demonstrate to them your value. But what I mostly love about this is they search for truth. They're online trying to find the answers. They value individual expression, and they're a very non-judgmental segment of the population. That's also a fabulous characteristic. What we find, and this was interesting, McKinsey did a recent study on them because they're obviously looking at, promoting business with the Gen Z population. Their consumption's tied to ethics. They're gonna purchase companies that are interested in fighting climate change. They want to buy products that fit their values. They prefer communication, texting and social media. But what's interesting, more so than the millennials, they're very open to face-to-face, which is very important when you start to think about money, because in my view, that's the best way to have these conversations. Their online usage is the highest of any generation. What also I think is wonderful about them, they believe in dialogue to solve conflict and improve the world. So they're not afraid to have money talks. In fact, I have kids coming to me and say, why won't my parents talk to me? I want to hear what's going on. I want to learn. I want to become educated. So oftentimes we'll bridge that generational divide. However, they're also called the most depressed generation. And why is that? Because of all the chronic stress from school shootings, the politics. We're living in a very tumultuous time. They have a lot of concerns about, when I say school shooting, gun violence is a big deal for them, climate change, they're worried about police brutality. And what we find is because they spend so much time on social media, they tend to become isolated. And we also know with social media usage, there's an increase in isolation and depression. So this is a generation that really needs to understand, and the parents and the teachers obviously are seeing this, that they have, I think roughly 30% of this generation is feeling a sense of depression. That is a concern. And there's so many reasons. And COVID has really accelerated that. Kids feeling isolated, not being able to be with their peers and their friends. So that is something that we're all going to have to deal with, I think. And hopefully with COVID moving on, hopefully we'll get them back to school and some more, and they'll be able to connect, because we know that the best way to create, to deal with this depression is to create relationships, right? So let me talk to you a little bit about what we've observed in our practice. As you can see from my discussion just now, is that they're very different with different life experiences. And all of this impacts how they look at the world, how they view money, how they want to conduct themselves and have conversations. What I find is a positive is the millennials in particular are more optimistic about their future. And I think that has to do with the last 10 years where we've had a real economic recovery. They've entered the workforce. They're getting to a place where they're starting to make money. They're starting to buy houses. So that's all very positive. But what is concerning for people like me who work in an institution is they have lower trust in institutions. You know, I was really fascinated. Last Sunday, I saw Fareed Zakarian on CNN talk about the reasons why certain countries have done better with COVID than others. Obviously, it has to do with age, number one, but after that is trust in institutions and trust in your neighbors and individuals. And so unfortunately, as Americans, we are in a sort of a mistrusting time in our society. And that has influenced these millennials and Gen Zs. But what's also, on the other side of the coin, they're open to talking about finances more so than previous generations, which I find, really wonderful for us when we're trying to promote conversations. They engage in open and constant communication. They're more online. Obviously, they have more liberal social attitudes. What I find interesting about them, they really want to invest in values that they hold dear to them, whether it be climate change, gender diversity, equity, inclusion, all of that. They really believe in improving the world and putting their dollars where their values lie. And they actually influence boomers, and also with women, they are the primary drivers of this very big movement in impact investing right now. So if you want to interest your kids in starting a conversation about owning a company or a stock, ask them, what are your values? What do you care about? That might get their interest in starting to think about companies that align with who they are. But I will say cautiously, this David Brooks observation, which I find, who's the New York Times editorialist, I love him. He talks about how they're oftentimes less empathetic, more success-oriented, admit to being vulnerable, yet rate themselves high on leadership and social self-confidence. So part of the issue with that is sometimes we find them to be overconfident. That can be a problem also when investing. It's actually a behavioral finance term, overconfidence. So we have to be a little bit, we have to be a little leery. We have to understand that there may be too much confidence in what they're doing, particularly when it comes to money. So let's talk about some of the topics that require money talks with the next generation. Well, certainly financial literacy is one that I know teachers and parents are very concerned about. The basics, opening accounts, how to save, how to budget, how do we spend? And I would add charity. I remember many years ago, I read about the Rockefeller who would give his kids a weekly allowance, and he would say, you need to divide it into 3 parts. I want you to save a piece of it, you can spend a piece, but I also want you to put aside money for charity. And then what I will tell you is kids watch what you do. They don't necessarily listen to you. So if you are being charitable and you're spending wisely and you're saving, I remember the other day my son said to me, I had no idea he was even listening or watching. He said, Mom, you're going to be fine because you've been saving all of your life. And I thought, wow, I set a great example for my kids. I didn't really talk about it, but they saw what I was doing, and they're both good savers. So I'm happy to say that. College planning was probably a very big conversation that many of you are starting to have or have been having. Where do the kids go to school? How much do I need to budget for it? There's loans I need to take out? What about grants? I mean, it's a very complicated process these days. And then, of course, charity, philanthropy. Many families who have the means are philanthropic. This is a topic where they can engage the next generation because, as we know, they're civic-minded. They want to make a difference. So, let them. We oftentimes say, let them find the charity that they want all of us to work with. So give them a role and see what they come up with. And as I mentioned, they're very interested in impact investing, aligning their investments with their values. And future talks could be on retirement, the impact of retirement on families. I talk about this in my books. And then estate planning, that is also a future talk to have. So here's the 5-step plan to guide us through the money talks. Money is a taboo. I refer to it as the elephant in the living room. Nobody really wants to talk about it. And there's a whole host of reasons why, which we're going to go over. But what I was going through, both as an individual with family members who were working through transitions and as a professional, I was finding people not really having productive conversations. I was seeing conflict, I was seeing families being torn apart, and I was seeing monies being put at risk. And when I did the research, I found that there's a 70% failure rate in transferring money across generations. And the biggest reason is a lack of communication and trust. I mean, it far surpasses any of the other reasons. And so breakdown in trust and communication obviously is not a good thing when you're trying to get through all of life's transitions. And so not only is it with respect to estate transfers, but I find it true in all of financial transitions where it's, and I'll walk you through a few, but it's also topics, transitional topics like planning for college, getting ready to send a kid to college. That's a topic that could come up. So you want to identify the transition point. That's the first thing that you want to do. You want to spot and overcome the roadblocks. I call this the preparing the inner landscape. A lot of this is very psychological, which we'll briefly review. Then the third step is what I call prepare physically, logistically, and psychologically, or preparing the outer landscape. You know, I liken this to if you're going to go into a very important business meeting with your best client, you have probably thought through what you're going to say. You put through an outline. You may have even rehearsed. You may have role played. I liken these kinds of conversations, and you've thought about where you're going to do it, when is the best time. It's similar. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then I talk about picking the pros. And it could be not necessarily a professional, but a trusted individual who is competent in this area and has the trust of all the parties. And then I say it's important to have a process and repeat as necessary. So here are some of the transition points that I identify in the book. Changes in financial circumstances, whether it's up or down. That's a time in someone's life, in a family's life. Individuals are going to be impacted. It's time to have a conversation. Remarriage and merging families. You know, when you're getting married or getting remarried, you're merging values. I'm going to talk in a moment about you're also merging family histories around money. So you really have to start talking about that, what you care about, what you value, and of course you have to be fully transparent about what you own and what you owe. Retirement planning is an obvious one. It can impact family members in a huge way. Caring for an elderly parent, we see that, you know, many people don't want to disclose their health is declining. Certainly there's dementia that can set in. All those conversations need to take place. And then preparing heirs, estate transfers, and business succession. So these are the 5 main ones, but there can be topics along the way, like college funding, right? Yeah. And so once you identify the transition point, I'll always say you got to start looking at what you own and what you owe. So, you know, this is just a very simple schedule to start thinking about what kind of assets you have, what are your liabilities, and what your income and expenses are, because those are going to be impacted by whatever you go through, and they're going to help inform you about what you need to talk about in your money talk. So this is the second step, spot and overcome the roadblocks. So these are, I call these more on the surface. So I'm just going to pick a few here to kind of discuss with you. So one is control. Does anyone have it? You know, when I was, before I wrote my books, I did a radio show in New York for a few years, and I studied at the Wharton School for my SEMA designation, and one of my professors was Charles Dwyer. He's a great guy, smart as a whip, and talked about control on my radio show with me. And he said, you know, no one really has it. The only thing we can control is our own reaction, our own response, and the way we behave. We can't control anybody around us. But what he did say, which I really thought was fun, he said the people who hold on to control are the ones that least get that, right? But it becomes an issue because much of the conversations that we have with family members is who's got the control, how do we relinquish control, how do we discuss the new roles and responsibilities? So you've got to be able to address that big elephant in the room. Trust. Trust is another piece of the puzzle. Finding someone you trust. You know, we see that trust has really declined, as I mentioned, in our society. But we also see it's very important to find someone or find professionals that you can trust. And what we typically will talk about are 3 elements to trust. Reliability. Can this person be relied on to do what they say they're going to do? Sincerity, does their inner self match their external presentation and representation? And are they competent? Will they be able to do the job? Do they have the skill sets? These are oftentimes the conversations we'll have when we're dealing with an aging parent. You know, who has the financial skills? Who has the legal? Who has the physical care? And the ability to oversee that. And then another one that I oftentimes see is health issues, which are taboo. Oftentimes we'll see elderly people not being able to really accept the fact they're in decline, accept the fact they may have early dementia, and start to have these conversations. So these are some of the initial roadblocks on the surface, but then I'd like to go a little bit deeper. So these are more psychological. I'm going to highlight three: gender, age, and family history, which is my personal favorite. So gender differences are very, very profound, and they're brain-based, so they're physiological, and this has been confirmed by over 30 studies involving 1 million participants. So whether you're a woman in China or in America, you have a certain brain physiology that makes you different than your male counterpart. And let me just mention, and why is this so important? It results in them making different financial decisions. It results in them having different investment strategies, goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon. So let me talk to you some of the reasons for it. You know, women have a different sized anterior cortex of the brain than men do. So as a result, we're very contextual. We tend to take in multiple sources, we rehash, we rethink, we want to come to conclusion, we want to get input. Men, on the other hand, tend to take in a few pieces of information. Now, this is generalization, right? There are exceptions to the rule. Take in a few pieces of information, make quick decisions, and move on. You can see where that might create some conflict, right? Let's talk about another difference. Women have stronger connections between their emotion, memory, and communication centers of the brain. And why is that so important? Women tend to resolve conflict by talking about it. We remember everything. We remember who slighted us 30 years ago. My God, we have this memory for emotions. Men don't really have that. So you can see why it's much easier for women to have money talks or to initiate them than a man, just in general speaking, right? And the third thing is we have different sized prefrontal cortexes. That's the part of the brain that really controls strategic thinking. So women tend to be much more long-term in thinking. We tend to want to think about family, the next generation, more so than men. And it's fascinating. The research shows that women actually women managers, money managers, outperform their male counterparts because of this, because we have a much more long-term, where men are much more short-term transaction oriented. Okay. So obviously, if you're a father who's going to have a conversation with her 17-year-old daughter, and he's going to have to think through, what is her way of making decisions versus him just sort of taking it. She probably would want to, whatever he's suggesting, she's going to want to do research. She's going to want to talk to people about it. She's not going to come to it so easily. Okay. Let's talk about another big difference, or another less obvious factor, and which is age. So we've talked about the differences in the age, in the age cycle, generational cycle. But what does that mean in terms of money talks? Well, first of all, there's going to be different topics. Younger generation, they're going to be more interested also in investing in something they care about. So it could be a difference in an investment strategy. It could be in a different way of communication, right? There's different communication forms. There's also going to be a dialogue about institutions. They may not want to go with the institution their parent wants to go with. So you've got to take in all of those age differences, and it's deeper, obviously. You need to think through. Family history, this is my personal favorite. I actually talk about creating what we call moneygrams, where you can actually, on a piece of paper, you can outline family histories with respect to what I call three values or elements of money: how you acquire it, how you use it, and how you manage it. And so, for example, in my family, My father came from a family where there wasn't a lot of money, but they were very thoughtful about how they acquired, used, and managed it. They were willing to obviously save, but they also set money aside for charity. It was a really good role model that my father picked up from his mom, okay? He didn't have a father. His father died when he was quite young. My mother, on the other side of the equation, came from a fairly well-to-do family, big spenders, didn't really set aside enough money for tomorrow. And at the end of the day, my father actually helped support my grandmother because she didn't have, and they lost the business due to some reversal of fortune. But I guess my point is, my mother's behavior came from her family, okay? So at the end of the day, you can actually see these systemic patterns of behavior between family members. And what I find fascinating is if you take somebody who comes from one family history that marries or is living or has a significant other with a different, we oftentimes see that as huge conflict. There's problems that can arise and you need to resolve them with money talks, right? So remember that family history, and oftentimes it means that somebody has to change the systemic pattern along the way. So maybe that's happened in your family, or maybe you want it to happen, but it clearly doesn't happen overnight. So let's talk through what I call preparing physically, logistically, and psychologically. So obviously you understand what your life transition point is. You've talked through some of the obstacles that you need to consider, but here's the meat and, this is the meat and potatoes, so to speak. You want to understand, what are the objectives and goals? What do you want to accomplish? What are the specific financial issues and topics? Is it college funding? Is it figuring out a way to also fund for college, but plan for retirement? There are potential, then you want to consider what the potential problems and factors are on the outer and inner landscape. So this is really, is there a challenging family member that you're going to need to think through how to handle, right? And are there control, trust issues? All of that you're going to have to consider. And then I talk about using professional communication techniques. You want to answer the why, who, what, when, where, and how. So why is it important for you to have this conversation? Who needs to be involved? What are the topics? What are the issues? When is the best time? We all know that you don't want to go to your parents and ask for money when they're watching the football game in the Super Bowl, right? It's just not the right time. But you want to make sure the right time to bring people together. I often say not Thanksgiving, not Christmas, too much stress. Find a moment where you can all meet comfortably or do a Zoom or webinar. And of course, the where, is it a Zoom or webinar or in person? And the how are you going to conduct it? So let's talk a little bit about that. Well, you want to prepare. Preparation pays. Look, before I talk to any groups like this one, I always have an agenda. I always want to figure out in advance, what are the topics that are most important? What's the best way to get them across? So you want to base it on what I call the issues at play and the players at issue. Who are the issue players also, right? You want to circulate and modify an agenda. So it's oftentimes, if you're going to have a talk, you may want to have the agenda put together that you can email around to the parties and say, this is what I'm thinking. What else do you think we need to add to the conversation? And then I often say, it's not a bad idea to kind of rehearse, have a script, rehearse. They talk about 60% of communication is the nonverbal, right? So maybe you want to role play. Maybe you want to look at yourself in the mirror. I mean, obviously, talking about money with an open set of arms is a lot better than sitting back like this and, talking about how you're going to control the money conversation. So you want to make sure you understand the communication style and be prepared. And then I talk about the question and answer and process to resolve conflict. So conflict will arise. There's always conflict around money, right? Parents fight about money. They fight about kids. What else do you guys fight about? Okay, so those are the biggies, right? But I think what I refer to is the inquiry, acknowledge, advocate, and problem solve. So the first step is inquire. If you're going to have a meaningful conversation, listening, using these ears is the best place to begin. You want to ask questions. How do you feel about this? What are your concerns? What do we need to address? Get some feedback. And then, of course, you can acknowledge what you're trying to first of all, you want to acknowledge what they're saying. Yes, I get it. I understand. Thank you for sharing that with me. Then you obviously want to advocate. What is your position as the parent? What am I trying to advocate for? But then obviously you need to let your child advocate on his or her behalf, or them, I guess, right? So the problem solving is the last part of it. You need to come up with a solution that you work through together. And I would always say, come with an open mind, plan to make change, because in any agreement that comes around money, it's going to be hard for you to be tight-fisted and get through your entire proposal and do it in a way that you keep family relationships intact. And then, of course, you're going to have to do this on more than one occasion. So I talk about scheduling the next meeting and oftentimes letting another person take on a leadership role in that conversation. So the fourth step is pick the right individual or professional. So oftentimes people will come to me and they'll say, can you help me talk to my kids? I have family members come to me and say, help them open an account with you. Let's start to educate them. You may have a current advisor on board, but you might have a trusted third party, if you don't have an advisor, that can be involved and help you out. But I always say you need to make the right choice. It needs to be someone, if you're going to bring somebody on board to help out, you need someone impartial and will be trusted by all the parties. And then you need someone to be the quarterback, sort of to lead the discussion. And then my final step is, this isn't going to happen at one time. I remember with one of my clients, we were trying to get her to do a power of attorney, right? And start to transfer some of the control, input to her children. It didn't happen overnight, right? We had to have multiple conversations with her to help her understand. And then we wanted to try and gift money to help with the grandchildren's education. That was a whole nother set of conversations. So don't expect this to be a simple, this is what I want, this is what I'm going to get, and move on. You got to have a process. You have to know what the issues are to address and figure out the best method of conversation and communication. And I always say, park those devices at the door. You know what? I don't know about you guys, but I don't like my kids on their phone while I'm trying to talk to them. So it doesn't help for communication. It doesn't really show a full modicum of respect. And I don't feel they're fully engaged while they're distracted. So, and then you're going to talk about the next talk agenda and who that leader is going to be. So let's walk you through a couple of examples. So you have high school students aspiring to higher education. So obviously you're identifying the transition point and issues. Will it be community college or college university? And the biggest question is, what are the financial sources or hurdles that you need to face and deal with? Spot and overcome the factors interfering with the talk. Are there money constraints? Is there somebody who's too controlling? Is there who is the trusted person? What are all of the other things that are going on in that family that are interfering? You need to think that through. And of course, prepare physically, logistically. I talk about personalizing and internalizing. Make sure you can be inside another person's shoes. Try to understand what they're going through. And then of course you might want to get help and the repeat is necessary, okay? And of course, as parents, you probably know that there's counselors at school that can help navigate college. I know that we actually hired a third party to help us with the college planning, but there are a lot of ways to go. So we have two kids here. One is John, age 16. He lives in Jersey City. His mother is single. English is her second language. She has 2 jobs to support. He's a very gifted student. I'm sure as parents, you've seen this, right? Very gifted students, but really don't have the resources. He's working, he aspires to be an engineer, no savings for education. So what do you think the topics are going to be around that conversation, right? Well, where do we find the money, right? How do we go about finding it? Who do we contact to help us find it? What are the resources that mom could potentially offer? And what can John do? Is it a work-study program? Is he working towards saving money? Maybe he gets loans for tuition, but he needs spending money. So that's a conversation about how we're going to save for that. Now, you take Kelsey on the other end of the spectrum. She lives in Ridgewood, New Jersey, which is a very affluent neighborhood. Both of her parents are professionals. She's the youngest of 3 daughters. She's a very excellent student. She babysits to have spending money, but that's not a family that's going to have really a big trouble with sending their kids to school. It may be that they all don't go to the school of their choice, the most expensive of their choice, but because they have 3 kids to educate. But that's a very different set of facts, and how you want to think about framing your money talk. Okay. So to recap, I would say regardless of economic size and structure of family or the gender composition, money talks are overwhelming. It's very important that you understand the why it's difficult and why it's necessary, and the what. What do you want to accomplish? What are the topics? What's the transition that you're dealing with? And identify all the obstacles to your talks and follow the process designed to help you. And then I'm just going to say these millennials and the Gen Zs are ripe and ready. They are open to having this conversation. You just need to demonstrate some leadership and willingness to kind of schedule it and put it together. And then the call to action. I would say, what are the obstacles interfering in your money talks, and when will you get started? Okay, so I think that concludes. Oh, did it in about 40 minutes. Great. Okay, so Charlene, or 50 minutes, I'm going to turn it over to you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Lori. And again, for any of you on today, I highly recommend her book, The M Word, The Money Talk Every Family Needs to Have About Wealth and Their Financial Future. Lots of what she talked about today, in addition to a lot more great advice is in the book. So Lori, first of all, thank you so much for all the information. I love how you set the stage around how generation standing changes how kids look at money, such an important concept. And that especially the millennials and Gen Z really interested in the things that they value. That's wonderful advice. Ginny asks, does Lori have recommendations or resources, books or websites for teens and young adults to learn about finances and investment planning?
That's a great question. I always told my kids to read the newspaper, right? Just look at the business section. You'll learn a lot. You'll also get, I never really talked to my kids. Look, I did a lot of research in writing these books. And if you were interested and you wanted to email me, I could give you some of those reference points. But I think a very basic place where I even began, because I was a musician who became a financial advisor, I started out by reading newspapers about money. I would read the business section. I would get the Wall Street Journal, start to educate yourself about the vocabulary. But there are a number of books that are really devoted, and I would be happy to share those with you if you wanted to follow up. I just don't have them at my fingertips right now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We will follow up on that.
Okay.
So Lori, some of our attendees are interested in sort of your advice around when is a good time to have a conversation about investing with young people. How early would you start?
I think the middle school is a time. Middle school and high school is a great time. I think there's a lot of financial literacy taking place, I think, in schools right now. And maybe these are life skills, and it's better to introduce them sooner than later. I also say that age 10 is a time where you can really start to introduce the notion of financial literacy, start giving them the vocabulary. When you get, giving an allowance is a great way to introduce not only the work ethic, so they work for their allowance, but it's also a great way to start to illustrate to them some of the good habits around money management. So so I think, but when it comes to investing, probably when they're in middle school, and that's a great opportunity to, give them a few dollars. We actually have clients, their kids are a little bit older, but they'll open up an account where we can actually have a conversation with them. The parent is the custodian, but we'll also talk to the kids a little bit about, what kind of things, do you value? What kind of companies are you thinking about? So I think it's an opportunity. If you were to open an account, you could start, or you could even do an E-Trade account or whatever to start introducing them to the notion of investing. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Good advice. So, Lori, do you recommend that children get a weekly allowance? And if so, at what age would you start that? I know you mentioned Rockefeller's advice, which is probably good,
Yeah.
about maybe helping them see that you can divide that allowance into different components.
Yeah, I talk about age 10. I think that's an formative age. The kids are, I think they're in middle school at that time, right? Early middle school. And they're thinking about, they're starting to learn, in school about money. And I feel like for my kids, I did give them allowance, but they were also working. They were trying to make extra money. So I always encourage them. One of my kids had a snow removal service in the winter times. So, you don't want to give them too much of an allowance, right? But I do think it's a great exercise in helping them to start thinking about money management at an early age. So yes, I think earlier is better than later. Yeah.
So would you offer the same advice in terms of setting up, for example, a savings account for kids?
Yeah, I think you could set up a custodian account, savings account with your child, and maybe that allowance part of it goes into that savings account. I did that with my kids. So yes, you could open up a savings account and you could have them put a piece of it into that savings account of their allowance. Let's say they make some extra money. You can encourage them to give money. I mean, I always like that Rockefeller model because it really does encourage people to think in multiple ways about money. So yeah, you could do that with the savings account as well.
So here's a parent saying, my husband and I both work full-time and COVID has been really challenging financially. At the same time,
Right.
We want to teach our kids to give back. How do we do that?
I don't think you have to do it in a monetary way. I think you can, I took my kids to the local church that had a food bank and they were feeding the homeless. And we would go there on the weekends on a Sunday and cook. I don't think you have to, if you want to encourage your kids to give back. It's funny. I had a client just recently reach out to me and say, I don't really want to just write a check. I want to actually do some good. And I think it's a wonderful thing to introduce to kids. You don't have to have money to learn how to give back. And I think it teaches them a great value at the same time and how to really, value all parts of society and to see that you can make a difference. So yeah, I strongly encourage that. Look, if they want to make a monetary contribution and you're a family that's philanthropic, that's an opportunity to have a conversation with them about what type of charities do you believe in? Some of them are interested in, giving back to, diversity, helping less fortunate people in their communities, encourage, organizations that promote fighting against climate change. I mean, there's so many things that you could do in terms of giving money, and you can just include them in your conversations and maybe pick a charity that they're most interested in. Because remember, they like to do things that align with their values, right? And they think about it. They're very, these younger generations are more civic minded than the boomers were. So that's a great thing to witness. Yeah.
Good to know. Thank you. Good advice, Lori. So I grew up in a house with a dad who was a really good money manager, but never said anything about it. Just sat at the kitchen table and paid the bills. You mentioned that we can change those dynamics.
Yes.
Do you think that kids should be involved in knowing, for example, what their parents' incomes are? How open should parents be?
That's a question I get all the time. It depends on the age and it depends on the kid's ability to process it, right? And, as I said, kids are watching you. They may not know what your income salary is, but they're looking around the house. They're, watching the vacations you're taking. They have a pretty good sense of what stratus of socioeconomic, you're in, right? So they're pretty much witnessing what's going on. And so I was very open with my kids. I was, and I some people will fault me for that, but I felt my kids demonstrated early on that they were responsible. So, not too long ago, I took my kids aside and, told them what their roles are in our estate plan. I shared with my older son, what we have and where it is. you never know when something's going to happen. And so I believe and of course, they're both very hardworking. And, I've also learned that just because you have some resources doesn't mean your kids are spoiled, right? Or that by talking to them about it, it's going to reduce their incentive to prosper on their own. I just don't believe in that. I know that a lot of parents are worried about it. But if you do it in the right way, if you set, guidelines, if you set boundaries, I do think having those conversations with your kids, because remember, more conversation is better than less, right? And people who get into trouble are not dealing with open communication, and they're not developing trust. And so I do think you have to do that. And that pattern in a family can be changed. I've seen it changed, but it's much easier to do that kind of openness when you come from a family where that is the case. So so I definitely believe in, but obviously you have to gauge the kids' ability to process the information, right?
I think that's so well said, Lori, really true. So just shifting again to a topic that's much on everybody's minds right now, it's college season, obviously. Again, we work with a college financial journalist, Lynn O'Shaughnessy, who really says to parents, you need to be involved with the college planning in terms of the money, because so often kids get their heart set on a school that the family can't afford. Right. What do you say about that?
It's one of those conversations you have to have. I mean, oftentimes you got to inject a little realism into that kid. Mm-hmm. And but here's the other side of it. If that kid has the aspiration and the ability to go to a great school, which is expensive, then let them take on that responsibility to find those funds. I mean, I've seen really gifted kids being offered scholarships. Maybe they're gifted as an athlete. That's another avenue where I've seen kids get into schools, great schools. So I don't know that I would squash their aspiration, but I would try and have that honest conversation about what it's going to take. And a parent saying, I can't afford this is okay, right? It's okay to say, I can't pay for this. I don't have the resources. The example I gave, right? That young man, but there is money out there for gifted kids like him. You just have to go out and find it. There's so many organizations that give out college funds and, nonprofits. There's schools. My kids got some scholarship money, but for academic reasons, right? And we were thrilled that they got some of that. But you have to really take the time and effort to go out and find it too. Yeah.
I like that, honest but aspirational conversations.
Yeah.
That's a good kind of middle of the road kind of advice, Lori. Right. So I want to respect everybody's time. We just are so grateful to all of you who've been on with us today. Lori, in just about a final minute, what is your final piece of advice for us parents with kids who we want to do well financially?
Well, I just wouldn't be afraid. I would just not be afraid to talk about this. It's interesting. My younger son's getting married, and we had a conversation with his future in-laws. And I was fascinated by the fact that the father-in-law has never had a conversation with my future daughter-in-law about money. And, nothing, none of it. Of course, my kids I'm fully transparent with them.
Yeah.
And I can sort of see that he's a very controlling guy it's hard. I'm not giving any names, of course, but I mean, he likes to control the finances in the family. So, in my view, he's missing out on the opportunity to have a dialogue with his daughter and an opportunity to kind of help share his values, right? And help her develop her own. So I really think don't be afraid. As I said, when will you get started? Figure out what you want to talk about and have that conversation. I will just one other thing I want to add. My book is being second edition is being updated. So it should be out by the end of the year, the beginning of next year. So if you come across my book, it's 10 years old, but it's still, I think it still resonates, the content, the process, but don't be afraid and get started. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lori, I should have mentioned that at the front.
Okay.
Yes, everybody, there is going to be a new edition of the M Word. We are so grateful. And you know, Lori, that's wonderful advice. You parents, it's kind of like the sex talk. Don't be afraid. We need to
Correct.
do it. It's important to be open with our kids, and you can change the culture for your children. That's what I say to my kids. You can do better. We've made a good start, but you can all do better too. This was
Yeah.
a wonderful conversation, Lori. So many
very
people
much.
are writing in the chat to thank you. So again,
Oh, thank
kudos to
you. It was
you.
really a pleasure. Good luck, and thanks for inviting me, Charlene. It was great. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. And again, this video will be available soon on our video library. We hope to see you again soon. Goodbye, everybody.